They gave me 48 hours to leave my home. The same day, I buried the woman I spent 10 years caring for. I was still wearing my funeral shoes when they told me I was worth $5,000. They thought grief had made me weak. They didn't know she had prepared for this. The rain had followed me home from the cemetery, cold and relentless, soaking through my black coat and clinging to my skin like it didn't want to let go. February always felt cruel that way, gray, damp, and unforgiving. My hands were still trembling from the moment I'd lowered Margaret's casket into the ground. I hadn't cried then. I'd been too focused on standing upright, on breathing steadily, on being strong the way I'd been strong for her for the last 10 years. When I opened the front door, I knew immediately something was wrong. There were shoes by the entryway, not mine. My heart thudded as I stepped inside, leaving wet prints on the hardwood floor Margaret used to polish every Saturday morning, long before her hands had begun to shake. The living room lights were on. Voices stopped mid-sentence. They were all there. My husband Ryan sat in the armchair by the window, the one Margaret had always claimed as hers. He'd never once sat there while she was alive. My son Daniel was on the couch, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor. Beside him sat Chloe, Ryan's younger sister, stiff-backed, holding a manila folder on her lap. And next to her, someone I didn't recognize, a thin man in a gray suit, posture straight, hands folded neatly like he was waiting for a meeting to begin. No one stood when I walked in. "Elena," Ryan said. His voice was flat, unfamiliar. "We need to talk." I stayed by the door, my fingers still wrapped around my keys. "Can I at least take off my coat?" "This won't take long," Chloe said. She was wearing sunglasses, indoors, even though the room was dim and the day outside was dark with rain. I noticed small, strange details like that when I was overwhelmed. It was something I'd learned during long hospital nights. When the world felt like it was spinning, you anchored yourself to what you could observe. I hung my coat on the rack near the stairs. Margaret had bought it years ago at an estate sale and insisted it was solid wood, the good kind. She told me that story while I was bedridden with exhaustion one night, changing her sheets at 3 a.m, trying to distract both of us from how undignified the moment felt. "Sit down," Ryan said. There was something in his tone that made my stomach tighten, something cold, commanding. I looked around. Every seat was taken. Finally, I lowered myself onto the ottoman near the coffee table, in my own living room, after my mother-in-law's funeral. Chloe opened the folder. "We found Mom's will," she said, tapping the papers like they were routine, unremarkable. "It was in her bedroom, in the drawer with her medications." My chest constricted. Margaret and I had talked about her will more times than I could count, late at night, during her clearer moments, when the house was quiet and the weight of the future pressed down on her. She'd been afraid, not of dying, but of being forgotten, of being mishandled. "She left the house to Ryan," Chloe continued, running a finger down the page. "Along with her savings, about $480,000. The room tilted slightly. I grabbed the edge of the ottoman to steady myself. "And for you," Chloe said, finally lifting her head. Her sunglasses reflected my own pale face back at me. "She left $5,000. I blinked. "That's not possible." "For your service," Chloe added. "That's what it says." "For my service." 10 years of lifting, feeding, bathing, medicating, soothing. 10 years of alarms every 3 hours so she wouldn't develop bed sores. 10 years of sitting through chemo appointments, radiation sessions, sleepless hospice nights where every breath sounded like it might be the last. $5,000. "Margaret told me the house would be mine," I said quietly. She was very clear. "Mom was on a lot of medication," Ryan interrupted. "She wasn't always lucid." "She was lucid," I said. "She knew exactly what she was saying." "There's nothing else in the will," Chloe said, tapping the paper again. "It's all here." The man in the gray suit cleared his throat. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "I'm Brian Patterson. I'm here to inform you that you have 48 hours to vacate the property." I stared at him. 48 hours. "If you haven't left voluntarily by then," he continued evenly, "formal eviction proceedings will begin." I looked at Daniel, my son, 24 years old. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Dad says this is what Grandma wanted," he murmured. Ryan stood. "Daniel's coming with us. You need to pack your things and go." Us. That word landed harder than anything else. I stood slowly, my legs weak but my spine straight. "I understand," I said. They looked surprised. Maybe they'd expected screaming, begging, tears. But after 10 years of caregiving, I'd learned something important. You don't fight when you're exhausted. You wait. You plan. And sometimes, you let people believe they've already won. Because they didn't know what was sitting at the bottom of my suitcase. I walked upstairs without another word. Behind me, I could hear Chloe closing the folder, the soft snap of finality in the sound. Ryan was already talking to the lawyer, their voices low and controlled, as if they were discussing renovations instead of dismantling my life. Daniel stayed silent. That hurt more than anything else. The bedroom door closed behind me with a quiet click. This room had been mine and Ryan for over 20 years. We moved into it when we were both in our 40s, already tired in ways younger couples couldn't understand. It had been our refuge once, shared laughter, shared plans, shared exhaustion after long days. Over time, it had turned into a place of quiet distance, two people sleeping beside each other but living in separate emotional worlds. I stood in the center of the room and tried to breathe. From down the hall came the faint hum of the baby monitor we'd repurposed years ago, back when Margaret was still alive. Even now, my body reacted to the sound instinctively, ready to get up, ready to help. It took a moment to remember there was no one left to tend to. I pulled my suitcase from the closet. It felt surreal, packing my life into fabric and zippers because a piece of paper said I no longer belonged. I folded clothes mechanically. Sweaters, jeans, the same black dress I'd worn to the funeral just hours earlier. Each item felt heavier than it should have. As I packed, memories surfaced uninvited. The first night Margaret came home from the hospital after her stroke. Ryan had stood frozen in the hallway, panic written all over his face. "I don't know how to do this," he'd said. I had, or at least I'd learned. I rearranged my work schedule, then I quit entirely. It was supposed to be temporary. It never was. I packed my old nursing scrubs, folded neatly despite having not worn them in a decade. I packed the small jewelry box Margaret had given me for my 50th birthday, a simple wooden thing with a brass latch. She held it out with shaking hands and said, "You never buy yourself anything nice." I packed the photo albums Ryan had once called clutter. "Everything's digital now," he'd said, lifting them toward the trash. I'd taken them back without a word. Downstairs, voices drifted upward. "She'll be fine," Ryan was saying. "She's resourceful." Resourceful. That was what people called you when they felt guilty, but didn't want to change their behavior. I zipped the suitcase halfway and sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. 10 years of being needed every moment of every day had trained my body to ignore its own limits. Now, with nothing left to do, the fatigue crashed into me all at once. There was a knock at the door. Daniel stood there, awkward, unsure. "Mom, Dad wants to know when you'll be done." I looked at him, really looked at him. He had Margaret's eyes, kind but hesitant, the kind of eyes that looked away when things got uncomfortable. "Soon," I said. He nodded, lingering like he wanted to say something more. He didn't. When the door closed, I reached for the last thing in the closet, a folded envelope tucked behind a stack of sweaters. I froze. Margaret had pressed it into my hand 3 days before she died. The room had smelled like antiseptic and lavender lotion. The morphine haze had lifted just enough for her eyes to sharpen, for her grip to tighten around my wrist. "Don't open it yet," she'd whispered. "Promise me." I'd promised. Even now, I didn't open it. I slid it into the bottom of my suitcase and zipped it shut, my heart pounding like it was trying to tell me something my mind wasn't ready to hear. 48 hours. That was how long I had to erase myself from a home I'd held together with my own hands. When I carried my suitcase downstairs, no one offered to help. Ryan barely looked at me. Chloe was already on her phone, sunglasses still on, like she couldn't bear to actually see what she'd done. The lawyer nodded politely, as if this were all standard procedure. I walked out the front door without looking back. The rain had slowed to a mist. My car sat at the curb, familiar and suddenly very small. I didn't know where I was going yet. I only knew one thing. They thought the will had ended my story. They were wrong. Because 3 days later, alone in a cheap motel room, I finally opened the envelope. The motel was the kind of place people stayed when they had nowhere else to go. A flickering neon sign buzzed outside my window, casting red light across thin curtains that smelled faintly of smoke and bleach. The heater rattled like it might give up at any moment, but I didn't turn it off. The noise was better than the silence. I set my suitcase on the bed and sat beside it, hands folded in my lap, unsure what to do with myself. For the first time in 10 years, no one needed me. No alarms, no medication schedules taped to the refrigerator, no middle-of-the-night calls for water or reassurance or help breathing through pain. The absence felt wrong, like phantom limbs that still ached even after they were gone. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, watching a faint crack run from one corner to the other. My body finally allowed itself to remember everything it had carried. 10 years earlier, Margaret had been strong-willed and sharp-tongued, the kind of woman who corrected your grammar and expected you to thank her for it. The stroke changed her in seconds. One moment she was arguing about dinner plans, the next she was on the kitchen floor, unable to move the right side of her body. Ryan had panicked. Chloe had flown home for 3 days, cried dramatically, and left again with promises to come back soon. Daniel had been 14, scared and confused, retreating into his room. And I had stepped forward. Not because anyone asked me to, because someone had to. Caregiving didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly. First, helping her walk, then feeding her, then bathing her when she could no longer stand safely. Each new task arrived before I'd fully adjusted to the last. I learned how to lift without hurting her, or myself. I learned how to smile while cleaning things no one ever prepares you to clean. I learned how to soothe panic at 2 in the morning when pain and fear tangled together and sleep wouldn't come. Ryan told people I was amazing. He just never showed up. Chloe sent expensive gifts twice a year and took photos for social media. "Grateful for family," her captions read. She never stayed long enough to see the hard parts. Daniel grew up believing everything was under control, because I made sure it looked that way. In the motel bathroom mirror, I barely recognized myself. My hair was streaked with gray I didn't remember earning. Fine lines traced my mouth, my eyes. Caregiving aged you quietly. There was no ceremony for it, no acknowledgement, just slow erosion. I thought about the night Margaret couldn't remember her own name. She'd stared at me, terrified, gripping my arm so hard her nails left crescent marks. "Who am I?" she asked. I'd held her and told her stories until recognition flickered back like a weak light. Ryan had been asleep upstairs. He said he had a big meeting the next morning. I'd never told anyone that story. I rose from the bed and went to the small table by the window. My phone buzzed with a bank notification. $5,000. That was what 10 years of devotion had been reduced to. A number on a screen. Enough to keep me quiet, they thought. Enough to make me disappear. I went back to the suitcase and opened it slowly. At the bottom lay the envelope. For a moment, I just stared at it. Margaret's handwriting was unmistakable, slanted slightly to the right, shaky but deliberate. She written my name like she always did, carefully, as if saying it out loud. I remembered her voice from those final days, suddenly clear after weeks of fog. "My children are not good people," she'd whispered. "I'm sorry you've paid the price for that." I'd told her not to say such things. I always defended everyone else. My fingers trembled as I picked up the envelope. Part of me was afraid it would contain nothing more than a goodbye. Afraid I'd built it up in my mind because I needed something, anything, to make sense of what had just happened. I broke the seal. Inside was a small key attached to a tag. First National Bank, safety deposit box. There was also a folded note. "Elena, I know my children. I prepared for this. Trust me. The real will is in the box. There is a recording, too. Call Bernard Winters. His number is inside. I'm sorry you have to go through this. You deserve better. Margaret." I sat down hard on the bed. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Not with fear, but with something else. Clarity. She'd known. All those late-night conversations, all those careful pauses, she hadn't been reminiscing. She'd been planning. I pressed the note to my chest and laughed once, softly, a sound that surprised even me. They thought 10 years of silence meant I had no voice. They were wrong. Because the lawyer I called the next morning told me he'd been waiting for me. The law office was in an old brick building downtown, wedged between a bakery and a shuttered bookstore. I recognized the bakery immediately. Margaret used to love their cinnamon rolls, before swallowing became too difficult, before food turned into another risk instead of a pleasure. I sat in my car for a long moment before going inside, the key from the envelope heavy in my palm. It felt unreal that something so small could carry the weight of my entire future. Bernard Winters looked exactly like I expected him to. He was in his early 70s, with thinning white hair, kind eyes, and the sort of posture that came from decades of quiet authority. When he stood to greet me, he didn't rush. He didn't look surprised. "Mrs. Chen," he said gently, "I've been expecting you." Those 4 words nearly undid me. He led me into a small conference room with a polished wooden table and a window overlooking the street. Sunlight streamed in, warm and steady, a stark contrast to the weeks of gray I'd been living under. "You have the key?" he asked. I placed it on the table. Bernard nodded and retrieved a metal lockbox from a cabinet. The key slid in smoothly, like it had been waiting its entire life for this moment. Inside the box were 3 items: a thick folder, a sealed envelope, and a USB drive. Margaret had been thorough. "The will your sister-in-law showed you," Bernard said carefully, "was not the legal will." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "The official will was executed 8 months ago," he continued. "It was witnessed, notarized, and filed properly with the county." He opened the envelope and began to read. The house was mine. Not shared, not temporary, mine. $400,000 was left to me outright. Ryan and Chloe were each left $25,000. No more, no less, with a condition so precise it made Bernard pause to let it sink in. "If either party contests this will," he said, "they receive nothing." Daniel's name came next. $100,000 placed in trust, accessible when he turned 25. I sat frozen, my hands folded in my lap, afraid that if I moved, the moment would shatter. There is also what we call a no-contest clause, Bernard added. Perfectly legal and very wise. But they had a will, I said. They showed it to me. Bernard's expression darkened. Then what they showed you was a forgery. The word echoed in my chest. Forgery. That's a felony, he said quietly. Margaret suspected they might try something like this. That's why she took additional precautions. He reached for the USB drive and slid it into a laptop. Margaret's face appeared on the screen. She was sitting right there in that very office, wearing the blue cardigan I'd given her for Christmas 2 years earlier. She looked tired, but focused. To whom it may concern, she said, her voice steady, I am Margaret Patricia Chen, and I am of sound mind. She spoke clearly, calmly. She named names. She explained absences. She described my care in detail I'd never voiced out loud. She deserves everything I have to give, Margaret said. She earned it. Tears blurred my vision. When the video ended, Bernard slid the folder toward me. Care logs, medical records, written testimonies from hospice nurses, notes documenting every missed visit, every broken promise, every excuse. She knew you wouldn't fight, Bernard said softly, so she fought for you. I closed my eyes. For 10 years, I had carried everyone else. And now, finally, someone had carried me. What happened next would bring the police to the house they'd already tried to sell. I filed the police report the next morning. It wasn't an impulsive decision. I'd spent the night in the motel staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the heater, replaying every moment from the living room. The confidence in Chloe's voice, the way Ryan wouldn't look at me, the lawyer calmly giving me 48 hours to disappear. They hadn't just pushed me out. They tried to erase me. The detective assigned to my case was a woman around my age, practical and calm, with kind eyes that missed nothing. She listened without interrupting as I explained the forged will, the eviction threat, and Margaret's real documents. Do you still have the fake will? She asked. No, I said. My sister-in-law kept it. That's fine, she replied, typing quickly. We'll obtain it. She told me not to contact Ryan or Chloe, not to warn them, not to argue. Let us handle this, she said. 3 days later, I was back at the house. My house. I parked down the street and sat in my car, watching the front door. The curtains were open. Boxes were stacked inside the living room. They were already sorting through Margaret's belongings, deciding what to keep, what to sell, what had value now that she was gone. They hadn't wasted a second. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. 2 police cars pulled up quietly, lights off until the last moment. I watched as uniformed officers stepped out and walked up the driveway. Ryan opened the door. I saw his posture change instantly, the confident tilt of his shoulders collapsing as badges flashed in front of him. Chloe appeared behind him, still holding her phone, confusion etched across her face. I couldn't hear what was said from where I stood, but I saw enough. Hands raised, voices sharp, Chloe's sunglasses slipping from her hand and hitting the floor. They were arrested right there on the front porch. For forgery, for attempted fraud, for exploiting a vulnerable adult. The house they thought they owned watched them leave in handcuffs. That night, my phone rang. Mom. Daniel's voice was small, uncertain, nothing like the confident young man who'd stood silently while they pushed me out. I didn't know, he said quickly. Dad told me Grandma wanted him to have the house. He showed me the will. I thought you were just upset. I closed my eyes. Did you help him make it? I asked. No, Daniel said, his voice cracking. I swear I just believed him. Silence stretched between us. You should have visited her more, I said finally. You should have asked questions. "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry." I told him about the trust, about the money Margaret had left him. He cried openly then, not about the money, but about the woman he'd barely known until it was too late. "I'm home," I told him when he asked where I was staying. "I'm finally home." The court case lasted 3 months. Ryan and Chloe pleaded guilty in exchange for reduced sentences. Headlines followed. Their reputations didn't survive it. And slowly, in the quiet after justice, something else began. Healing. But reclaiming the house was only the beginning of what I was about to build. The house felt different once the noise stopped. After the court dates, the lawyers, the apologies that came too late, there was finally silence. No arguments echoing down the hallway. No tension thickening the air. Just rooms filled with memories and the faint scent of furniture polish Margaret had always loved. For the first few weeks, I barely moved anything. I slept in the guest room because our old bedroom felt too heavy. I drank my coffee at the kitchen table and caught myself setting out 2 cups instead of 1. Grief had a way of hiding inside habits like that, waiting to catch you off guard. Daniel started coming by on Sundays. At first, his visits were stiff and careful, like he was afraid one wrong word would send me away again. We'd sit in the living room, now undeniably mine, and talk about small things. Work, traffic, weather. Then, slowly, he began asking about his grandmother. Not the sanitized version, the real one. I told him about the night she insisted on wearing lipstick even though she couldn't leave the bed. About the time she laughed so hard during a morphine haze that she pulled out her IV and apologized like she'd spilled wine on a carpet. About the morning she squeezed my hand and said, "You're the daughter I wish I'd raised." Daniel listened like he was storing every word somewhere, deep inside himself. "I wish I'd known her like that," he said once, staring at the floor. "You can," I told him, "by remembering who she chose to be at the end." The house started to feel less like a battlefield and more like a foundation. I thought about selling it. Friends suggested it. Strangers online too, cash out, start fresh. But this house wasn't just property. It was 10 years of unpaid labor. 10 years of sacrifice no one had acknowledged until it was too late. It was also something else, a place where people who give everything quietly could finally be seen. That idea took root slowly. I used a portion of Margaret's money to start a small caregiver support program. Nothing grand at first, just meetings in the living room, coffee, folding chairs, a place where people could speak without being told they were so strong instead of being offered real help. I called it Margaret's house. Word spread faster than I expected. Caregivers came with tired eyes and stories that sounded too familiar. People who hadn't slept through the night in years. People who'd been promised help that never came. People who loved deeply and were quietly disappearing because of it. Daniel volunteered every weekend. He made coffee, set up chairs, listened more than he spoke. I watched him learn something that had taken me a decade to understand, that caring for someone isn't a burden. It's a responsibility that should never be carried alone. 1 year after Margaret's death, Daniel and I planted roses in the backyard. She'd loved roses. Used to sit outside on good days, her wheelchair angled just right so the sun hit her face. We planted them in that exact spot. "She knew," Daniel said quietly, pressing soil around the roots. "Didn't she?" "She suspected," I said, "and she protected me the only way she could." We worked in silence for a while. Then Daniel looked up. "Thank you for not giving up on me." I smiled. "You showed up eventually. That matters." That night, alone in the house, I opened the photo albums I'd saved from the trash. Tucked into the back of the last one was a folded note in Margaret's handwriting. It was addressed to me. What she wrote gave me something I'd never had before: permission. I sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's note in my hands for a long time before I opened it. The house was quiet in that deep, settled way that only comes after grief has burned itself down to embers. Outside, the roses Daniel and I had planted shifted gently in the evening breeze, their stems still thin, still learning how to hold themselves upright. The paper trembled slightly as I unfolded it. Elena, if you're reading this, then my plan worked. You're home, you're safe. I'm sorry I didn't protect you sooner. I swallowed hard. Margaret's handwriting was shakier than I remembered, but the words were clear. I watched you give and give until there was almost nothing left of you. I saw how my children took your strength for granted. I let it go on for too long. This is me making it right. Tears blurred the ink, but I kept reading. I'm not just leaving you a house or money. I'm leaving you permission. Permission to stop sacrificing. Permission to stop shrinking. Permission to take up space and demand respect. Build something for yourself now. You've earned it. I pressed the note to my chest and cried, not the sharp, breaking kind of grief I'd been carrying, but something deeper and quieter. Relief. Validation. Release. For the first time since the funeral, I felt like I could breathe without bracing for impact. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's house grew. Local nurses volunteered. A social worker offered free consultations once a month. We brought in a legal advisor to teach caregivers about their rights, things I wished I'd known years earlier. I watched people walk in hunched over, apologizing for taking up space, and leave standing just a little straighter. I realized I had done that same walk for years. Daniel changed, too. He asked questions, real ones, about the choices he'd made, about what responsibility actually looked like, about whether showing up late was better than never showing up at all. It is, I told him, as long as you keep showing up. One afternoon, he asked the question I'd been expecting. Do you think you'll ever talk to Dad again? I thought about Ryan in his orange uniform, about Chloe's influencer career unraveling under headlines she couldn't filter or delete, about the decade I'd spent making myself smaller so they could feel comfortable. I don't know, I said honestly, not because I can't, but because I don't have to. That was new. Choice had never been part of the equation before. That night, I stood in the living room, the same place where they'd told me to leave, and looked around. The furniture was the same. The walls were the same. I was no longer the woman who stayed quiet to keep the peace. I was no longer the invisible caretaker waiting for permission to rest. I was Elena Chen, homeowner, advocate, mother, woman who had finally learned that love without boundaries becomes self-erasure. Margaret hadn't just left me an inheritance. She left me myself. And 1 year later, standing in the rose garden, I realized just how far that permission had taken me. Spring returned quietly. Not with any grand announcement, but with small, stubborn signs of life. The roses in the backyard sending up new shoots, the mornings growing brighter, the house warming naturally without the heater humming all day. I noticed these things now. Before, I had been too busy surviving. It had been 1 year since Margaret's funeral. Daniel and I stood in the garden together, dirt under our fingernails, the roses finally strong enough to hold their own weight. They'd bloomed earlier than expected, deep red and soft, their scent filling the yard. She would have loved this, Daniel said. She would have corrected how we planted them, I replied, smiling. We laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that doesn't erase sadness, but learns how to live beside it. Margaret's house had grown beyond anything I imagined. What started as folding chairs in my living room had become a real network. Caregivers from neighboring counties drove in for meetings. Local doctors referred families who were drowning quietly, the way I once had. I watched people arrive hollowed out and leave with resources, with names to call, with the simple comfort of being believed. And I watched my son change. Daniel no longer volunteered out of guilt. He volunteered because he understood, because he'd learned that love isn't proven in speeches or inheritances, but in presence. "Do you ever regret staying?" He asked me that afternoon as we wiped our hands on old towels. I considered the question carefully. "There were moments I thought I'd disappear entirely," I said. "But no, because even when it cost me everything, it mattered." He nodded slowly. Later that evening, after Daniel left, I sat alone in the living room as the sun dipped behind the trees. The house was quiet but no longer lonely. I pulled out the photo albums again, the ones I'd saved without knowing why. This time, I didn't rush. I let myself linger on faces, moments frozen in time that once felt ordinary. Margaret as a young mother, Margaret laughing at a picnic, Margaret holding baby Ryan before life hardened him. And then, near the back, a photo I hadn't noticed before. Margaret and me. We were in the kitchen, both laughing, flour on our hands from some failed baking experiment she'd insisted on trying despite her limitations. I remembered that day now. She'd been exhausted, but happy. She had seen me. The realization settled gently in my chest. She hadn't just protected me legally. She recognized me emotionally, something I hadn't realized I was starving for. I stood and walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the banister, the door frames worn smooth by years of use. These weren't just structures, they were witnesses. To patience, to endurance, to quiet love. I stopped in the doorway of what used to be Margaret's room. It had been converted into a small counseling space now, warm and inviting, filled with light. "This mattered," I whispered. And for the first time, the words didn't ache. They felt complete. That night, as I locked the door, I finally understood what she'd given me wasn't just justice. It was freedom. Freedom didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, almost unremarkable moments. Sleeping through the night without jolting awake in panic. Leaving the house without checking my phone every 5 minutes. Making plans that didn't revolve around someone else's medications or moods. At first, the quiet felt unnatural. For so long, my worth had been measured by how useful I was to others. When no one needed me urgently, I had to learn who I was without that constant pull. Margaret's house helped with that more than I expected. As the program grew, I found myself speaking in ways I never had before, advocating, teaching, explaining legal protections and caregiver burnout to rooms full of people who nodded with painful recognition. They listened to me. Not because I was sacrificing, but because I had something worth saying. One afternoon, a woman about my age stayed behind after a meeting. Her hands shook as she held her coffee cup. "They say I should be grateful," she told me, "that it's an honor to take care of him." I looked at her tired eyes and said, "It can be an honor and still be too much to carry alone." She cried then, so did I. Daniel started bringing friends to volunteer. Young people, curious, uncomfortable at first, then engaged. I watched them learn what our culture rarely teaches, that care is work, that love requires boundaries, and that exploitation often hides behind phrases like family duty. One evening, Daniel stayed late to help clean up. As we stacked chairs, he paused. "I think I understand now," he said, "why you stayed and why you left." I smiled softly. Those aren't opposites. The house itself seemed to breathe differently. Rooms once heavy with obligation now held conversations, laughter, healing. The living room where I'd been told to leave had become a place where people arrived seeking safety. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit by the window and think about Ryan and Chloe. Not with anger, With distance, I realized something then that surprised me. Justice didn't require my bitterness. Their consequences existed whether I fed my rage or not. My life was no longer defined by what they took. It was defined by what I built. On the anniversary of Margaret's death, I returned to the rose garden alone. The flowers were in full bloom now, strong and unapologetic. I knelt and pressed my hand into the soil. "You did this," I whispered. "You saw me." And in seeing me, she'd changed everything. I stood, brushed the dirt from my knees, and went back inside, to the house that was finally completely mine. Not because I'd won a legal battle, but because I'd reclaimed myself. And then, in the last place I expected, I found one more reminder of who I had become. I found it while reorganizing a drawer I'd avoided for months. It was tucked beneath old manuals and loose keys, another small envelope, yellowed at the edges, Margaret's handwriting faint but unmistakable. I sat on the floor and opened it carefully, as if the paper itself might dissolve if I rushed. "Dear Alina, if you've found this, then you've begun living instead of surviving. That was always my hope for you." I smiled through tears. "I wish I'd given you more while I was alive. More recognition, more protection, more gratitude. But I see now that what you needed most wasn't praise. It was release." I thought about the years I'd spent shrinking myself to keep others comfortable, about how easily that had become my identity. "You were the architect of everyone else's comfort," she wrote. "Now build something that belongs to you." I folded the letter and held it against my heart. That night, I pulled the photo albums out one last time, not with grief this time, but with peace. I saw the life that had led me here, not perfect, not fair, but meaningful. I wasn't the scapegoat anymore. I wasn't the silent caretaker, waiting to be acknowledged. I was Alina Chen, 62 years old, homeowner, founder of a nonprofit serving caregivers across 3 counties, mother to a son who was learning, slowly but sincerely, how to show up. And a woman who had been loved deeply enough to be defended, even after death. The house creaked softly as it settled around me, familiar and safe. Outside, the roses stirred in the night air, their scent drifting through the open window. I turned off the light and stood in the quiet, no longer afraid of it. Margaret had given me justice. She had given me freedom. But most of all, she had given me permission to take up space, to demand respect, and to finally live. And this time, I wasn't leaving.